Torrential rain across the east coast of Australia today has resulted in flood warnings being put in place for parts of Queensland and New South Wales. The Bureau of Meteorology says the drier El Nino conditions have almost finished, with the climate pattern now changing to neutral ENSO conditions. So what does it mean for the farm sector? I caught up with Stefan Vogel, the head of food and agri research at Rabobank, a little earlier.
Look, I think it's overall positive news. Clearly, we've seen it can rain in an El Nino year. So that was already the good news when we had rains in November, we had rains in January. Now we've got more rains coming. March was probably one of the wettest we have seen in a long time, but we're talking averages. So you have a couple of pockets, and especially the north around the cattle areas in the Northern Territory, northern parts of Queensland. These guys got really good rains. And that is unseen and unheard of. So I think good conditions and bringing back the confidence for them that there's enough grass on the ground to feed the livestock throughout the season. If you're thinking about where we are in the rest of the agri space, we are heading into the period when farmers want to put the grain in the ground. So planting of canola will start here in the next 2-3 weeks across most of the country, followed shortly after by those bigger crops of wheat and barley. And clearly, I think the rains overall are good news, and we need definitely some more. But we have started the season with really good subsoil moisture in most parts. So a little bit further down in the ground, there was good moisture already. Now those rains are topping up. There's still a few pockets where it's dry. If you look into Victoria, it has been a rather dry March. If you're looking into parts of South Australia, pretty hot, pretty dry. So these guys still need a bit of rain. Similarly, in many pockets of Western Australia. So the country is a little bit divided. The eastern side, the northern side of the country is looking really wet, which is really good. The rest of the country probably still wants to have a little bit of a rain when the crop's getting into the ground.
And when is it too much rain? Because there is flood warnings now on the east coast, some parts of the east coast. Yeah. When is it too much?
Well, too much is always hard to judge, but if you think across the past, what we have always seen is that more rain is usually better. Yes, you have localized floodings, and that's really devastating for those who get hit by those floods and get destructions of their housing or machinery and so on. But that's usually more localized, while it rains around and then it's positive. So if you're thinking back, I think the good news here is still it rains across many parts that needed it. And if you think about what that means for us as an establishment of the crop, we're heading into a season that probably can be a really good one once again. We had 3 fantastic seasons in a La Nina year. We had still a pretty good season in an El Nino year, and now we're heading hopefully out of El Nino and into maybe a La Nina. So there could be more news and more rains coming in the couple of months. So overall, too much rain, maybe locally, but overall, good news.
Yeah, last September, the Bureau of Meteorology declared the end of La Nina, but it seems like they're almost ready to declare the end of El Nino.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how much do farmers rely on accurate forecasting from the Bureau?
Look, I think as a farmer, you really want to try and figure out what to do. And it's very hard in hindsight to say, oh, the forecast wasn't right. I'm an analyst, I'm doing a lot of forecasts, and I wish I was always right. So I think if you think about the Bureau of Meteorology, they were actually one of the last ones calling in for an El Nino. A lot of others were already out there, the US institutions, the European institutions, because they look at a slightly different set of indicators that is determining if it is an El Nino or not. So the bomb was actually one of the last ones. And then if you look in the books, it tells you it's usually dry on the eastern side of Australia. So I think we've done everything right, but well, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, actually the weather didn't turn out as dry. So very quickly getting out of an El Nino is also not the usual. You very often have those events sticking around a little longer. But overall, I think let's go beyond the path of, well, it was a call and it turned out a bit different, the weather, than it should be in an El Nino year, but the rains were good. And we take it from here on forward that hopefully there's more coming. So we're positive.
All right, so more rain clearly on the way. What does that mean for cattle prices in the cattle sector over the next few months?
Yeah, if you look at the cattle prices, I mean, they took a very, very devastating low hit last year. So prices dropped significantly below what we have seen in the last 10 years around that time when it got very dry in the northern parts of the country here where a lot of the cattle are. And the weather forecast didn't help, saying that probably it's going to stay dry. As soon as we had the November rain and then the January rain, prices took an upside. And the reason for that is when farmers don't know how long it will be dry, They have to think, well, I probably don't have enough feed on my farm. I need to get rid of my cattle and slaughter more than I actually want. And so they started doing that. There was a lot of meat in the system. We now seen prices coming up quite a bit, which is helpful. We're still well below what the typical average price has been in the country. So there could be more upside, but it is very hard to see those prices move very quickly further up because we're needing to export a lot of volumes, and the export market is rather congested. So the likes of Korea, of Japan, they have a rather full-fledged suite of meat still sitting on shelf, and we try to push more volumes into those markets because those are our typical destinations. The good news is maybe coming out of the US market. The US has a shortage in meat. Their inventories and their livestock herd is not as good as it need to be. So that's maybe the good news, that over the season the US imports more than typical. That's helping. But overall, the economic conditions are not great around the world, and consumers usually have a look, what do I take from the shelf? And chicken most of the time is a bit cheaper than the red meat sector. So one or other just grabs the chicken piece rather than a steak. And that's what we're also feeling on the demand side.
You mentioned winter crops starting to be planted over the next sort of few weeks or months. What's the outlook for grain and oilseeds?
Yeah, so on the pricing side, we have seen prices come down massively from the record high levels we had 2 years ago. But that was a very strange constellation of price upticks. So we had the first time ever in 10 years a real shortage globally of grain production. So we produced globally less grains than in the previous year, and usually you need about 30 to 40 million tons more grain. That is a normal Australian grain crop. We need more every year around the world to feed our rising population, the livestock sector, the ethanol sector. So with that, it was the constellation of this plus the uncertainty of the war in Russia, Ukraine. Prices have come down because if we're looking now going forward, there is a pretty decent volume of grain available, both still sitting here on some farms in Australia, but also in the other export competitors we're facing. The Russians have produced very good crops, and it looks once again like a pretty solid crop they will harvest in that region. But for most of the wheat crop around the world, May is the very crucial month in the Northern Hemisphere to determine how good the yield will be. So we have to sit here another 6-8 weeks to see how the May shapes. But it looks like there's plenty of grain or enough grain around the world. We don't expect prices to fall further, but we see it not coming up, especially also as Russia and Ukraine, both despite the war, are exporting strong volumes to the world market.
Stefan Vogel from Rabobank, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.